let you guys know, every single session will be recorded and you'll have the option to revisit this training anytime you want to. We'll be sharing the links and the presentations with you daily as well. Let's get started with our first overview presentation, which basically will cover everything from our training approach, agenda, some of the scope of the training that we're also planning to deliver. So here we go. Let's just get this presentation started here. So we've done the introductions of the team, and we can move on to what we plan to cover throughout this first session in the morning, which lasts 2 hours. So for these first 2 hours, I'm just planning to go through the slides on this PowerPoint presentation because as far as we are aware, the idea was to start with an overview of Umoja, what we plan to cover, what we plan to tackle during this training. We know that in the attendees, there are people that are very knowledgeable. And let me just make sure I get the chat out of the way here. And that are very knowledgeable. Actually, the majority of you joining our training are actually LPETs. So again, bear with us for things you already may know and be very familiar with, but I know there are some other members of the team of the training that are not that familiar with it. Okay, so let's just share my desktop. Can everybody see my desktop? Okay, I think yes. And
Yes.
If not, just let me know. Thank you. Okay, let me just get this out of the way. And let me go back to my desktop. Here you go. Okay, so let's go through the slides and let you guys know what we plan to cover and what the aim of this training is. Okay, so the idea is that a total of 42 staff members, maybe 43 at this point, are going to be deployed to help with the liquidation of the mission in UNAMID. The focus of this training will center on the following topics, the ones we see here. You may be familiar with these or not. These are the ones we're going to cover throughout the 2 weeks. So we're going to train you guys on how to close pending transactions, whether it's receiving goods, return to inventory, or addition to inventory. Also, the closing of STR/STO processes, transfer of inventory, how to close STR/STO processes, reconciliation of inventory data with counting and controlling and physical verification, alignment of PIDs and the master data, so with equipment assignment, enrichment, and handover, and also reduce dead stock and retirement of fixed assets, okay, with the management of fixed assets, write-off, and disposal through scrap and sale. Okay, that's the main focus of our training. That's what we have prepared for. And we have a number of exercises ready for you guys to practice. Although you're familiar with it or not, the exercises have been created for anyone to be able to tackle these processes in the system, whether you're an expert or a newbie to Umoja. And one of the key elements of this training is going to be our reporting aspect, okay? Not only in ECC, but also in BI. So we're going to be jumping into BI throughout the training, mostly during the afternoon sessions, to show you guys not only the reports that are available for you, but also how to use them properly. And we'll even work together on how to generate the most efficient reports so you guys can access these when you're deployed in the mission to know exactly what the status of the mission is before you start, what issues you should tackle first, and then even have a report of what the status of the mission is when you're done. So like that, you can follow through your progress throughout the time you're deployed. Okay, how we plan to prepare for this. So again, the training team has prepared transactional materials. Now I'll go through these slides quickly, but I just want to give you guys an idea of what the scope of this training is. Okay, so we have detailed transactions, okay, which covers step-by-step processes in Umoja with the T codes, suggested reports, and the roles involved. Each one of you will receive the same full set of transactions, okay, that can be performed individually or in group. Of course, I'm not sure if you're all home or if some of you are actually at the base. I saw that Michael was in the office at the base, so some of you may still be there and together. So you're free to either practice them on your own or join in with a couple of colleagues and work on them together. And these materials are meant to be used not only as practice, but also as reference. So what we have done with these exercises is not only detail the roles and the T codes and transactions step by step, but also we have added links to job aids and even some definitions of some of the concepts that we think are key for each one of those transactions. And then what we plan to work on with you, since we also have experts in whether it's property management, inventory management, or warehouse management, what we want this training to be is more of a back and forth discussion as well as to the typical troubleshooting scenarios that you may encounter and the business impact from these transactions. So we want to definitely learn from your expertise and add this to the maybe exercises and transactions that we're creating, so that when we send out the post-training package, we can send you these materials updated with the information that we've shared throughout the training. Okay, so this is not a monologue of us talking to you and showing you different transactions and PowerPoints, but we want to also receive your expertise and feedback throughout the training so we can update our own materials and make sure that you have the most up-to-date exercises and transactions you can take with you to the mission when you're deployed. Okay, the BI reports that we plan to share with you. Here's a quick screenshot of the amount of reports that we can be looking through and working with. Those related to equipment, inventory, and so on. Also the themes here: physical accountability, write-off, equipment inventory, disposal, fixed assets, and so on. So you see that we have reports to cover all of our needs during the training. Okay, so we plan to incorporate these reports to help you guys improve the understanding of current status of missions prior to starting the liquidation process. Okay, but not only that, but also how to extract these formatted reports from BI, and this is for all the core team deployed. Now, to use these reports, to actually see them, access them, and use them, you're going to need the BI 55 role, which we hope that the majority of you have, if not all by now. And if you don't have it at the beginning of the training, don't worry, because we're basically going to show you how these work, share our screen and the recording, and you can always access these reports when the training is over and you have your role. So the best thing would be for you to have them before we get started, but if you don't worry, you can always access these afterwards. And move on to the objectives, okay, of the training, the assessment. Now, we have an assessment planned for you guys during the training, but it's not an assessment per se. What we want to do is, after we've gone through the 2 weeks of transactions in the system, we want to give each one of you a specific transaction to perform in the training environment, and that's going to be your assessment, right? You will have to, as it says here, students will have to perform a complete transaction individually. In this case, the assessment will be performed individually. Of course, there's no way we can control that, but that's the idea, that you individually will be able to take one of these transactions that we forward to you and process it completely from beginning to end. The way we will know if you've been able to process this transaction is you'll have to return to us let's say a cover page where you have the blank fields and you have incorporated either your material document, your transfer order, your transfer requirement, and so on. We'll give more explanations on that as we go on through the training, okay? But the assessment is not an assessment per se, multiple choice question, pass, fail. It's really just for you to understand if you're capable of performing a transaction in the system fully based on what you've learned throughout the training, okay? And the transactions here, I'm not going to go through the whole slide. I think it's quite self-explanatory, and you guys will receive this PowerPoint after this session is over. If there are any questions at any point as I go through the presentation, please don't hesitate to just unmute yourself and speak up. If I don't hear of you, I'm just going to keep going. But I think it's quite clear. Okay, we'll give you guys transactions to practice throughout the 2 weeks, and then at the end of the training, we'll give you one of these transactions for you to perform fully in the system. Okay, and I'll show you a brief look at what those transactions look like, so it's easier for you to understand what we expect from you. Okay, and again, as I was mentioning before, we're talking also about a post-training package. So what we're going to offer you now daily is the training package itself with the transactions and the exercises and the cover pages. But when the training is complete, we will make sure we update these training packages, these transactions, with the latest information we received from you and your expertise, so you have the most up-to-date transactions with you when you're deployed to the mission. Okay, so we will give you the updated version, as it says here, with instructions on BI reports to use and the setup, a new cover page with training environment credentials, and additional information on the business impact and possible troubleshooting scenarios. Okay, what we want these transactions is to serve as a guide, okay, guide and reference that will include every step. If you are deployed in the mission, you're working with other people, we want these transactions for you to be simple enough to just print out, hand out to somebody that's working with you, and they will be able to follow the steps in this transaction as well. And I'm going to show you that next. Okay, before I go on to our last screen here, let me just exit this PowerPoint presentation, and I want to show you what these transactions look like, okay, before we actually forward them to you. So what you see here on screen is what we call our cover page, okay? Each one of you will receive one of these cover pages, which are basically two-page documents where we have the description of the scenario we are going to practice, which is here, okay? For example, this one, which is for inbound delivery and physical goods receipts. What we expect you to learn from this exercise is how to process pending physical goods receipt transactions purchased from a vendor with DAP Incoterm. To be able to do these exercises in the training environment, we provide you with not only the materials that you guys can use, the plant and storage location, but also the credentials that you will need to log into the system and perform these transactions, as well as the documents needed to perform these transactions. Okay, these cover pages will also have reference to the reports that you can use or that are useful for you for this specific transaction. You see here for ECC, the same thing for BI. And then the second page will always have a brief summary of the transactions used step by step, okay, and role by role. So if you're the inbound coordinator and you're performing the search for list of inbound deliveries, you'll have your T code there, and so on for each step of the process. Okay, I think the screen stopped sharing for a second. Okay, let me go back to it. Here you go. All right, so I think that's quite simple as well. These cover pages will be sent together with the actual exercise, and the actual exercise looks like this. Okay, you'll receive the exercise, for example, for physical goods receipts, which we plan on sharing with you on day 2. And here you'll see that we have not only a brief description of what the exercise is about, but the job aids that you can use that are very useful for these transactions. Of course, we can't cover every single aspect of the process. So we have the main process, let's say, and we have added the job aids for any specifics that you may need to understand as you're going through the transactions as well. And we just wanted to make your life easier and add the links to these job aids and user guides here in the exercise. Also, they will have an explanation on how to log into the training environment. Those of you who have come to our trainings in the past are quite familiar with how this works. And then once we explain to you step by step how to log into the training environment, we start with the exercise step by step as to what role you need and the T code that you have to use and the screenshots and instructions to perform every single step of the exercise. Okay, so I think that's quite simple. We'll start with these exercises tomorrow. So again, we'll become a little more familiar on how the cover page and the body for the exercise work together. You will need the data in this cover page to be able to perform the exercise that we provide to you. All right, I just wanted to show you that very briefly, and I'll go back to my presentation here. Anything so far? I don't see anybody asking questions. I don't hear anyone either. So I can move on with the presentation here. Okay, the idea of putting you together into these 2 weeks worth of training is that we thought that most of the GDP processes involve all work streams, whether you work in inventory management, warehouse management, or property management. We think that really all these transactions require knowledge of every single aspect. Whether you're working in inventory or warehouse, you need to understand how one transaction impacts the other. So we thought the best idea would be to have you all together in the sessions. Now we know that some sessions may impact some streams more than others. Okay, we also thought that the core team deployed would be better prepared to deal with the issues encountered if you know a little bit about all the work streams and how the impact from one action affects the other. You will have a better grasp on GDP processes, and then also the BI reporting portion of the training, right? We plan to add a small, or let's say a critical BI reporting aspect in each one of the sessions, okay, of the day. So we'll start tomorrow with that. Today we'll have a brief overview on BI, but tomorrow we'll start digging into how these reports can help us for each specific transaction. And basically, it would also help you guys understand the end-to-end of the transactions. We know sometimes, based on our experience on trainings, that some people working in as requisitioners or people working as inventory users or warehouse senior users don't want to really understand what happens somewhere else. They just want to focus on their aspect of work. But really, for this training, we think that the best is to understand how each transaction impacts some other work stream in the process. So we thought that the best thing would be to have you all together. Okay, the agenda. Next topic is the agenda. So you have received an email with the agenda, I think last week. The only change, if you guys are taking a look at the screen now, is we made a slight change on day 3. We've changed day 4 for day 3 because we thought it made more sense to first learn about enrichment, assignment, and handover before we actually did any returns to inventory in addition to inventory. But basically, the rest of the agenda is exactly the same. So today is day 1, and what we plan to do is this overview session we're doing right now, where we're going to just jump into in a few minutes into the master data, roles and responsibilities, and some of the reporting essentials. Okay, and also the complete end-to-end processes. We're going to basically learn that in the next few minutes. Okay, and then starting day 2 and so on for the rest of the week is when we jump into our exercises. Okay, we'll start with receiving goods and move on to manage equipment. Again, working on receiving goods, but this time for return to inventory, addition to inventory. On day 5, we're going to be seeing the inventory transfers. And day 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, we'll move on with counting and controlling, physical verification, write-off. Again, in this case, disposal methods scrap, and then write-off for disposal methods sale. And finally, the retirement of fixed assets with and without revenue. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the agenda for the 2 weeks. All right, no one's jumping in, so I'm moving on. You'll receive this presentation by the end of the session regardless. Again, the certification process, this is based on the assessment. Again, we go back to the assessment. So we want you to perform that exercise that we consider the assessment so that we can eventually register you in Inspira as an attendee for this training and provide you with a certification. So this certification doesn't work like the ones we had in the past with the LP, LPET, but it will be a sort of a proof of participation in this training. So it's important for you not only to attend the sessions, of course, we're not making them required, but we highly encourage that you join all the sessions, that you complete all the prerequisites prior to the training. Hopefully you've done that already. If not, you still have time to do so during the week. And then you complete the assessment. So basically these 3 points here are the ones that you will require to receive your certification in Inspira. Okay, again, this is just a certification for, let's say, accomplishment of the training. It's not a pass or fail training. It's basically just proof of participation and also that you've gained enough knowledge to be able to perform any of the transactions that we teach you during these 2 weeks. Okay, now just for your information, all webinar sessions will be recorded. We're going to give you guys the transactions, as we mentioned before, each one of them day by day, and then also you'll receive the post-training package. So this is the last slide with reference to the training itself in our approach. And now let's start with the basic overview, right? We'll start with the scope of this training, as we have been showing before. But already we're going to start learning, for those of you who are new to these transactions, right? For those of you who are new to the liquidation as well. Sorry for those of you who are experts already, but I think this will be a good review for all. What we plan to cover and how we plan to do so. Okay, so we've broken down the training in basically 4 parts here for receiving goods, manage inventory, inventory transfers, and the disposal of goods. Okay, we plan to start with the goods receipt. So we're talking about basically incoming goods. So when you're deployed in the mission, we suppose here that even though this is liquidation, there'll still be pending transactions in terms of receiving goods physically or virtually, and how to process those transactions. Make sure that these goods received are properly inserted into inventory and also into the warehouse in its proper bin, and how this is done. We know that they may not be the majority of the cases, but I'm sure that you will have a number of them. So we thought it would be important for you to understand how this is done. And throughout this this transaction of goods receipt, we want you to understand mainly the difference between what we would call inventory management and warehouse management. So for those of you who are new to this these topics of the training, those of you who have not been part of our GDP trainings in the past 2-3 years, this is all very new for you, and this could all be very confusing for those of you who are new to this type of training. So we want you to understand that we're not going to be talking about purchasing. We're not going to be performing the raising of shopping carts or the approval of POs. We're going to be starting our training from the inventory management and warehouse management aspect, and first of all, receiving the goods. So we want you to understand the difference between inventory and warehouse. Okay, for those of you who are not that familiar with those concepts, they're very different concepts, and we have a couple of slides here that are going to show that difference, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of this hour and a half of the training. Okay, in the inventory management aspect of things, we want to cover the physical and virtual goods receipts, as I was explaining before, basically how to create your inbound delivery, update your inbound delivery, and perform this physical goods receipt of goods in inventory. What materials that we received are quality managed and which need to be inspected, but as well how to perform a virtual goods receipt and how that will require you to also have or create a stock transport order, an outbound delivery document, and how that is processed. Okay, the major difference between inventory and warehouse is that if we receive goods into the inventory, we're only telling the system per se that we've received these goods. So it would be the difference between taking notes on a piece of paper and saying you've received a box of goods, but then you also have to make sure that this box of goods is received in warehouse, which we would, I guess, consider to say that it's the physical aspect of the goods received, right? So when we talk about warehouse management, we're basically focusing on the physicality of the goods received, while inventory is more of a virtual concept, but we need to make sure that these two are aligned. And I think this is going to be one of the major things to keep in mind during liquidation, right? The alignment of both of these, inventory and warehouse. So making sure that whatever I have on a piece of paper saying that I have 10 boxes of this, 15 boxes of that in my inventory is also the 10 boxes and the 15 boxes in the warehouse. That's one of the major things that Piero was dealing with, right? The inconsistencies between what we have in our warehouse and what we have in our inventory. And we want to make sure that that is clear. So one of the first things I want you guys to think of, even though it's quite simple to define it like this, inventory management is when we're talking about the goods we receive into the system. And then the warehouse management is the goods we receive physically into a warehouse, a specific location in the warehouse. That's mainly the difference between these two. Okay, we'll also talk about the return to inventory in addition to inventory. Okay, once we're done with the goods receipt, the inventory transfers and how these impact with the management of inventory or of equipment. And this is what we call equipment enrichment, assignment, and handover. Okay, every time we perform one of these processes, whether it's a good receipt, a transfer of inventory, an addition or a return of inventory, we need to make sure that we tell the system that the specific equipment is either incoming now and it's new to our inventory, or it's old in our inventory, or if it has to be deactivated. So any type of transaction like this that is affecting our inventory needs to also be, let's say, told in the system that we need to update the equipment, whether it's an assignment or an enrichment or a handover of this equipment. Now, I know this can sound like a lot for anyone that has just joined in and has never practiced these transactions before. But again, this is just the overview session. Okay, any questions so far? I know I'm just going on and on, but I don't see anyone coming up. I don't know if the chat function is working as of yet. If not, we'll make sure it's working in the afternoon. But any questions so far, if anybody wants to speak up? If not, I'll just keep going.
Hi, Brian.
Yes, Daniel?
Just to double check that I cannot add the members to the chat so far. So we will do, I think it's better to do it in the afternoon session. So we make sure that this action has no impact in the current session that you're delivering right now. Okay?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, well, at least you're all able to unmute yourselves and speak up, so feel free to do so at any point. Okay, now again, since we're talking about the receipt of goods, the return of goods, the addition of stock of goods, and also the equipment management, as we saw here, right? Since we were talking about these points and this scope, basically, what we want to focus on as well is that these transactions that we're talking about here in the screen right now basically affect what we call the inventory and the warehouse management of things, but also impact, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the reservations, right? The outbound and the inbound of goods. So there's something that we call the reservations, which we need to generate for when goods are coming in or they're leaving our inventory or our warehouse. We'll also become very familiar with that, how to create these, have these approved, and how these are necessary for when we want to perform any of the transactions that are affecting the inventory and the warehouse management aspect of things. Okay, the full picture of the scope. Now again, adding the counting and controlling and the physical verification. So once we have received our goods, once we have either performed the return of inventory, addition of inventory, transfers, updated our equipment, we're also going to learn about the counting and controlling and physical verification, where we're looking at our warehouse stock and we're looking at our inventory stock, and we're making sure that they both show the same picture. As I was saying before, if we have in our inventory 10 boxes of paper, we should make sure that we have those same 10 boxes of paper in our warehouse. If we have split them into different bins and different sections in the warehouse, we have to make sure that they're there and they're accounted for. This is going to be one of the main things you're going to encounter during the liquidation in the mission, is the inconsistency of data between inventory and warehouse. And what you have to understand when you finish this training is how to deal with these inconsistencies, right? To make sure that the pending transactions are closed. And once this is performed, which of course will probably be the major part of your work in the mission, you also will learn how to perform the write-off of goods that have been used, that are of no use anymore, and how to do that through disposal methods, whether they are scrap, sale, or the retirement of fixed assets. Okay, this is going to be a big part of the training as well. This is mainly covered during the second week, and it's also going to be a major part of your role in the mission during liquidation. Okay, so this slide I think represents very well the difference between the structures of inventory and warehouse. So let's take a good look at this screenshot here. So we have the structural elements of inventory management, basically impacting the plant and storage location. We have them here at the beginning of our process. And we also have them at the end. If we want to call it the end, you'll see that the reservation part of the transactions is not really the end, but sometimes it's the beginning of our transactions. And then you have the structural elements of the warehouse, right, which affect the storage type, storage section, and storage bin, mainly linked to the warehousing aspect. And the end-to-end process. So what you see here on screen is an end-to-end process that we created when we were delivering the first Galileo decommissioning project training, mainly from goods that are incoming, right? So from our purchasing. Again, we're not covering this during the training, and how to receive these goods, the inbound goods, into our inventory, whether it's physically or virtually. How to create transfer orders for put away when we want to take these items or materials, let's call them materials because that's the concept we're going to be using during the training, and how to transfer these to the warehouse, right? So from their, let's say, virtual concept to a more physical concept, and how to put those away in the warehouse in a bin and make sure that they're stored physically in the warehouse and we account for them as well. Okay, so I think this screenshot can help you understand the structural elements of warehouse and inventory and how they're separated here visually, but in a sense they work together, and you'll see how that's the case throughout the training. Okay, so let's dig into these structures. All right, inventory management structure first, and the elements of each one of these, and then the warehouse management structure. So first thing here under inventory management, this is used to manage inventory levels, and it labels the tracking of materials on quantity and value basis. Okay, the structural elements of the inventory are plant and storage locations. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with these concepts, but those of you who are not, the plant basically describes the mission, okay, the physical location of the mission. So if you're deployed to Darfur in UNAMID, UNAMID would be the plant. And then in UNAMID, you have a set of storage locations, which is where the inventory levels are, right? So where you first receive your materials, you receive them into inventory, and these are stored into storage locations. Okay, and the main function of inventory, the inventory structure, is to move stock for either goods receipt, goods issue, and stock transfers. Okay, goods receipt, things that are incoming, goods issue, things that are outgoing, and stock transfers from either plant to plant or within the same plant. So basically moving inventory back and forth. Okay, and these elements, how they're integrated financially, okay, to enable the financial postings. We'll learn as we go through these slides how the storage locations themselves are linked to fund centers and how these fund centers are responsible for the items in the storage location in each one of them. And the difference with the warehouse management and the warehouse structure elements is that now we're talking about physical space. So as I was saying before, we have our inventory levels. We can think of it as virtual data versus the physical data, which reflects the structure of our warehouse and any transactions within the warehouse. So when we're talking about warehouse, we're talking about the physical aspect of the materials that we've received. The structural elements of the warehouse, we have the actual warehouse. We'll learn that this can be an actual physical location in a plant, or it can just be a, let's say, a numerical figure in the system that we can use to say where the goods are stored physically. And inside a warehouse, we have the storage type, storage section, and storage bin, which in a sense are specific sections of the warehouse and specific locations of where the goods are stored physically. Okay, and the main function here would be to create transfer requirements and transfer orders. We use these basically to give the order to move goods physically from one section to another in a warehouse, or maybe from one warehouse to another warehouse in the same plant, or from one plant to another plant. Okay, but these are mainly functions that create orders in the system for people in the warehouse to move goods physically. Now, you would move these goods physically in the warehouse, but then you would also have to move these goods virtually in the inventory. Okay, I'm going on. Again, interrupt me at any time, those of you who are following. Okay, so as we see here, and I was mentioning before, the impact of inventory management transactions on warehouse management operations. Okay, so these two are linked together. Whenever we make a move in inventory, we have to make a move in the warehouse. Okay, let's go into more of the concepts and the definition of the concepts so we become familiar. So a plant is the location where materials are purchased, received, inventoried, and valuated and shipped. Okay, there's the storage location, which reflects the inventory owned by a particular fund center in a plant. And we have here the structure breakdown coming up in a minute. What we have to understand is how these fund centers worked and how they're linked to these storage locations. So this is one of the concepts that we had quite some trouble the very first few times we were delivering these trainings, and to explain how the fund centers can have multiple storage locations. So to understand this, let's think of the engineering fund center, right? So if the engineering team is in charge of purchasing goods and these goods are being received, the fund center for engineering can have multiple storage locations, but they're all for engineering, okay? As well as, for example, the medical group can have the fund center for medical that is linked to storage locations only for the items that we would consider medical. So you would be the owner of the items that you've purchased through your fund center. So fund centers can have multiple storage locations, but no two fund centers can share the same storage location. All right, so what that means is that, for example, your engineering fund center cannot share the storage locations of your medical fund center. Okay, so that's the main idea here. I know it seems quite simple, and we'll understand this a bit better as we go through the transactions. And again, sorry for those of you who are experts on this matter, but we just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Okay, let's go on here to our next point. So materials and inventory are managed in the storage locations. As I was mentioning before, when we receive goods into the inventory, these materials, right, we first store them in these storage locations. All right, so this is an inventory concept. So materials will be in these storage locations. And let's see here with this image if we can understand this a bit better. So we have our plant, for example, in this case, UNGSC is the mission, which is also considered the plant in Umoja. And then we have the storage locations. We have one for CITS and we have one for engineering. So when we receive these goods, we receive goods either in the storage location for engineering, or we receive these goods in the storage location for CITS. Okay, so again, we have a brief description of the concepts here. So peacekeeping missions, MONUSCO, MINUSCA can be considered plants, but also special political missions here, UNHQ, and some of the entities as well. Okay, and the storage locations, again, sites where Fund Center controls inventory. All right, I'm moving on to our next slide here, where we have more of a visual breakdown of what a plant is and a storage location is. So again, we're starting with the plant, again, the logistic base, and you see here the small detail IT01. What does IT01 stand for? Well, this is the nomenclature of the plant in the system in Umoja. So when we're talking about IT01, we're talking about the plant UN logistic base. Okay, so when we receive goods into a specific plant, and this plant is IT01, we're talking about the UN logistic base. We'll become very familiar with these nomenclatures, IT01 and others. You'll see SD10 for UNIMID, and you'll become familiar with those, just like these storage locations. So for example, here we have a storage location for communication, which has its own nomenclature in Umoja, which is 1101. So we'll be using 1101 every time we want to receive goods into the UN logistic base IT01, but we want to make sure that they are added to the communication storage location. Okay, we have, as you can see, several other storage locations for medical, engineering, transport, and so on. And then we also have what we know as the virtual storage locations. And this is a virtual storage location for goods that are in transit, okay, mainly used for virtual receipts. And we'll learn about this during tomorrow's session and how to use this when we're receiving goods virtually. So what this means is basically when the ownership of the goods occurs before the goods are actually in our plant, in our mission, let's say, we have to perform a virtual goods receipt, and we have to take ownership of the goods at a handover location point. So the goods are not yet in our plant, but we are responsible for them. So we have to add these goods into our inventory somehow. And we do this through the virtual location. Okay, I know it's a lot to understand just verbally. We'll become more familiar with this during tomorrow's session. And then how these are linked to the not only fund centers, but also the fund. So the plant for UNLB is linked directly to the Fund 20 BLA. And the storage locations, as you saw before, are linked themselves to the fund centers, which are linked to this Fund 20 BLA. Okay, as we see here, the fund centers, for example, for...
Sorry, Brian.
Yes.
Brian?
Yeah, sure.
Is this just for training purposes? Because we see that there are some discrepancy with the storage location that you just mentioned.
Yes, I'm sure that they're not completely accurate. It's just basically for training purposes to understand. But I'm sure the numbers here for the storage locations are not the real ones.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry.
All right, thank you. No, thanks for making reference to that. So yes, these storage locations that you see here, just the same as the ones you see in your exercises, may not be the realistic ones, meaning they're still going to be storage locations. They're still going to have the same amount of digits, but they're not going to be the real ones when you go into the mission and go into production, right? And start seeing the storage locations and fund centers for the mission that you're working on. Okay, but I want you to understand the linkage here, right? So we have a fund center and its linkage to storage locations, as we were talking about before, how these themselves are linked to the fund, okay, and are linked themselves to the plant. And right now we're only talking about inventory management. So just in inventory management, we have 3-4 concepts that are key to understanding this, which is the plant, storage location, fund center, and the fund. Okay, we see here that our engineering has one fund center, medical has one fund center. Again, all these digits here are just made up, so keep that in mind. Transportation has its own fund center, but we see that for these two here, we have the same fund center. So remember what we were saying before. So one fund center can have several storage locations. Okay, let's move on to our next slide here. The two types of storage locations. First, the stocking storage location, which is the one that we'll be using mostly during our training. So locations where the material physically stocked and managed. Each of them is linked to a fund center. We're already familiar with that. And they functionality indicate receipt for purposes of inventory management and accountability. Okay, so these are the storage locations that we were seeing in the previous slide. And then we have our transit storage locations, okay, the one we were talking about virtually, right? When we have not received these materials yet in the mission, but we are already responsible for them or we have ownership of them, we add these materials to transit storage locations. So these are locations outside of mission area, okay, ports of shipment, ports of entry, etc. Okay, and these locations are not linked to any fund centers. And the functionality is to indicate receipt, okay, for purposes of transfer or ownership, as I was saying before. Okay, so right now we've become a bit more familiar with inventory management structure elements, plant, storage location, fund center, and fund. And within storage location, we understand we have two types of storage locations. One's for the stocking storage locations and those that are transit storage locations. Okay, we'll dive into these tomorrow with the exercise of physical and virtual goods receipt, and I'm sure it'll become more simple for those of you who are new to all of this. Okay, let's dive into now the warehouse structural elements. Okay, so we have our warehouse here. So we can come up with the idea of a warehouse. We're all familiar with this idea. It's a location, a physical location that we can go to and walk inside of, but it's not the case all the time in Umoja, right? We can have warehouses that are not physical locations per se. Okay, I don't want you to think of a warehouse directly as that, but in Umoja, we have a warehouse and a warehouse number that we use to make sure that these materials that we received are stocked in a specific location in the plant. Okay, so I want you to become familiar with that. So here in this case, we see them here as physical locations, A, B, C. Okay, so these would be physical warehouse locations in a specific mission. And these have what we call storage types, which identifies different buildings or facilities in a warehouse. Okay, and maybe here this will help us understand. So within a warehouse, we can have different storage types depending on the types of materials that we're storing, right? We're not going to put the medical materials in the same place as the engineering materials and so on, right? We have different storage types for the different types of goods that we're receiving into our warehouses. Okay, and then we have within those storage type, which are the different buildings, facilities in a warehouse, we have storage sections, which are subdivisions of storage types, okay, on their basis of their spatial or technical characteristics. Okay, so in a sense, here we can see the rack area, or the pallet area, or even the container area could be something we understand as a storage section. So it's a location within the warehouse. And then we also have the storage bin. Okay, so it allows the identification of the physical location at the detailed level. All right, so we can think of also a bin as the concept that we're familiar with. So it's really the final location of where the goods are at physically inside a what we call a bin, and they're created or deleted by the warehouse senior user. We'll dive into that also tomorrow. And the nomenclature, the maximum 10-digit nomenclature, but I don't want you to focus on that right now. So the warehouse structural elements can be quite simple when you become familiar with these concepts, but maybe at the beginning they're a bit confusing. So we have what we call the warehouse, which is the location in the system where we have our goods stored physically. Within this warehouse, we have storage types, okay, which are the different buildings located in a warehouse. We have the storage sections, which are also where the materials are let's say, put in depending on their technical characteristics or spatial characteristics. And then finally, the storage bin, which is the physical location at a detailed level of where these goods are stored in. Okay, again, you guys intervene at any time. Let's see with this structural element here a bit more visually, if we can understand this a bit better. Just like I did for inventory, we have here our warehouse, which in the system is known as Q01 for Brindisi Warehouse 1. So Brindisi Warehouse 1 has the nomenclature here of Q01. Okay, so the plant UNGSC can have several warehouses. Each one of those warehouses will have a different nomenclature. Maybe for Brindisi Warehouse 1, you have this one, but for Brindisi Warehouse 2, 3, and 4, you have Q02, Q03, Q04. Okay, so you have to understand that as well, the warehouse and conceptually what it means in the system and how this is broken down. So we have one warehouse, which is Warehouse 1 in Brindisi, but we have 3 buildings. Okay, we have Building 20, Building 144, and a zone. Okay, these would be the storage types, where we have also the nomenclature for these in the system. And these themselves, how they can have their subsections, which are the outdoor area, the rack, shelving, container area, disposal area, as we saw before, and these themselves can have their storage bins linked to them. So as we see in this image, we have our warehouse, Brindisi Warehouse 1, Q01, which has a total of 3 storage sections here, the buildings, right? 3 different buildings. In one of these buildings, we have a section for outdoor area, but we also have a section for rack. Well, Building 144 has its shelving area only, and Zone 183 has, again, 2 different areas, one for disposal, one for container. And each one of these subdivisions in the warehouse has bins linked to them. For example, shelving has these 4 bins linked to it. Okay, now I know it's a lot to chew, let's say, if it's the first time you're looking at this, and if it's the 500th time you're looking at this, it's just more of the same old news for you. Okay, just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So let's move on to our next screen here. Talking about the storage bin structure, okay? So the bins indicate the exact position of the goods, as we saw before, and it's possible to store different material types in the same bin at the same time. Okay, the bin name shall be unique in the storage type. We'll see that as we start working in the warehouse and we start transferring goods from bin to bin, or taking goods out of a bin with a goods issue to transfer either to another mission or maybe to use in the mission if we're talking about a construction project or any other project that we're going to need goods for. So we're basically going to have to dive into those bins to extract those materials in the warehouse, as well as also keeping mind of these transactions in inventory. Okay, so let's understand a bit better of how this bin coding works. Okay, the bin coding here. So we have here, for example, reference to a specific area. We're talking about shelving. The area will be abbreviated as SHL. So we're talking about the name of the bin. The names of the bins will have the nomenclature SHL if we're talking about a shelving area. For example, here, if you see it in the screenshot, the aisle number, we'll move on here, and the column position. So we have the aisle number 01, the abbreviation for the reference to specific area and shelving SHL. So SHL, aisle number 1, column position 1 as well, and also the tray position 04. So you see, you'll have a bin in the system when you become a little more familiar with this. Let me just get rid of this first. And let's take a good look because it's already difficult to see. So we have SHL 010104 is the name of a specific bin, right, where the materials are physically located. What this nomenclature means, or what it stands for, is exactly here, right? We see the SHL for the shelving area, the aisle number, the first 2 digits, the column position, the next digits, and the final tray position, the last 2 digits here. So this information in the bin name should be enough to describe exactly where the goods are located in the warehouse. Now, you'll also see in the training environment, a lot of these bins have just names like Brian, transfer. I'm sure that in your own mission, the people working in the warehouse may give their own names to these bins, which have maybe nothing to do with what we're showing to you here. And this is something we would like to also learn from you guys, because we may be teaching the way to go about it, right? Or the standard way to go about it. But then in real life, there's tons of changes in terms of nomenclature of the bins and how you do your transactions in the warehouse. Okay, but this is the standard for the nomenclature of the bin here. Okay, we would give the first 3 acronyms here, SHL, to describe exactly the specific area, if it's shelving or anything else, the aisle number, column position, and tray position. Okay, we have another example here and another example in the screenshot. So each one of these sections will have a different bin number, okay, to really specify where the goods are located. All right, so let's see now the inventory and warehouse integration, okay? So first thing, storage locations. Remember, this was a concept for inventory management. Storage locations can be linked to only one warehouse, and several storage locations can be linked to the same warehouse to separate the ownership of goods, okay? So several storage locations linked to the same warehouse to separate ownership of goods. And let's see the breakdown here and the linkage between the two. So what is the element that will link inventory management to warehouse management? Again, we remember the plant was one of those structural elements for inventory management. Connected to it is the storage location. Okay, and this storage location has its funds management derivations because it's linked to the fund center. Remember, a fund center linked to a storage location or several storage locations, and the fund center itself linked to a fund, a particular fund. And all these are structural elements of inventory management. Now, the warehouse management structural elements, we'll start with the warehouse, and that's the direct linkage between the warehouse and the inventory is the storage location. So the warehouse derivation comes right here. The storage location will indicate what warehouse we're looking for. So we'll see when we pull reports in the system A lot of the times the system will ask us to provide not only the warehouse, but also the storage location for that specific warehouse. So if we want to know if we have, let's say, medical equipment in a specific storage location in a specific warehouse, we'll see that we have T codes that will allow us to add the warehouse number that we're interested in extracting data from, and adding the specific storage location for that warehouse to understand if we have medical equipment in that specific storage location. We can have 3 different storage locations for medical, but maybe only one of them has goods in it. We'll check that too when we start performing our transactions. Maybe we want to transfer some of those goods from that storage location to another storage location in the same warehouse, and we'll learn how these 2 elements are linked together. So what other structural elements do we have in the warehouse? Again, the storage type. Remember, it was the buildings, the storage section, a specific subsection in the warehouse where goods are located, and the final physical location, which are the bins. Okay, so that's our last look at the integration elements between inventory and warehouse. And again, a last screenshot here of what that looks like overall, combining all the elements that we saw in inventory and those that we saw in the warehouse. So I think this is going to be a very useful slide for those of you who are just starting to understand the difference between inventory management and warehouse management and the structural elements and how they connect with each other. As you see on the top, we have the inventory structural elements, which represents the ownership of the goods, and then we have the physical space below, but how they're all linked together. So for the UN Logistic Base IT01 plant, we have several storage locations, which themselves are linked to the warehouse 1 here, Q01, which is linked to the different buildings and sections and, of course, bins. Okay, so this is a very good slide to understand that structure and how it's all linked together and how it's separated into structural elements as well. Okay, and last but not least, our last slide on inventory and warehouse elements. So you understand the equipment. So for example, in storage location 7000, again, fictional storage location, we may have computers and CDs, and these are linked to the fund center 10,013. So if this is, let's say, engineering or communications, the communications fund center is the one responsible for this equipment, and it's linked to this storage location. Okay, the same thing for another storage location in a different fund center, which may be responsible for a different set of goods. And the same thing for our last one here. You see that the materials in each one of these screenshots is quite different, and that's why they belong to different storage locations and different fund centers. And then in the warehouse management aspect of things, how these goods that are linked to this fund center and storage location are found in different bins, right? So in bin 1000, we'll have these particular goods, while in bin 2000, we have another set of goods, and in bin 3000, we have a different set of goods. So if you see, although the storage location 7100 that is linked to this fund center is responsible for these goods, and that's where these goods were received in terms of inventory, their final destination, you see the bag is in a bin on its own, while the boxes are in a separate bin physically. Okay, so physically, these goods are in different bins, but in inventory, let's say concept, they're in the same storage location. Okay, and that's what you have to understand, the difference between inventory and warehouse, physical location versus, let's say, virtual location of the goods. Okay. And I can go through this slide quickly here because I think we've seen enough of this. Again, you guys are not intervening more, so I'm just moving on. Okay, so you understand how this works when we receive the goods. Again, I know I may be just be a bit redundant, but again, this took a long time for our students in GDP 1 and 2 to understand, those who are now LPEs, and have a very good understanding of that. For those of you who are new, I know this is a lot to tackle in a few minutes, let's say, in 2 hours of this session. But for you to, again, understand these concepts, inventory management, we're talking about receipt of goods into storage locations, and then physical locations, storage type. Okay, so we're putting these goods away into a storage bin. Okay, virtual locations, physical locations. And the same thing happens when we're moving goods out. Okay, it's what we call picking in the warehouse management, and we'll dive into these concepts throughout the days too. Okay, when we're taking something from a storage bin, in this case storage bin 2, and we're removing it from the warehouse, and again taking it out of inventory as well, performing a goods issue. So just as well as the goods are received into storage locations and then put into a bin in the warehouse through the put away process, those same goods can be then taken out of a bin through the picking transaction, and then through the goods issue movement in inventory, get them out of the inventory system. Okay. And for those of you who have ever worked with Galileo, I decided to add here, I just left this slide for those of you who have worked with Galileo before, if this is useful for you. I won't go through this slide. I'm just going to display here all the points, and you guys can take a look at this on your own to understand how these terms and concepts are linked together. If you have worked with Galileo before, it's going to be definitely easier for you to understand the change in these concepts. Okay, but let's move on. I've also added a number of slides, so I would recommend you keep this presentation with you even when you're deployed in the mission, because it's a good reference to the types of movement types that we're going to be using, and it's also very good for you to understand what these movement types are. Okay, so to receive goods or to remove goods from inventory, what we need is movement types. So we'll be working with these movement types throughout the week for you guys to have a general idea of what these movement types are. They're, let's say, digits or codes that we enter in the system for us to perform a specific action. Okay, so you want for you to understand this, if we add the movement type 101, for example, in inventory, we'd be receiving goods into our storage location, whereas if we're using 103, we'd be sending goods to block stock. If we're using 124, we'd be taking the block stock, let's say, tag from materials and changing that. So I just want you to understand this concept of movement type. I don't want you to memorize any of this so far, because there are tons of them and it's a very complex thing to understand very quickly. But these are the movement types we're going to be using to be able to receive goods as well as to perform goods issue of the goods in the system. Okay, and I've provided with you with a set of slides here, just for your own ease to just go through them and understand what each one of these does and the type of impact that it has in the system. As you see, there are quite a number of slides here, and they're all used for different types of transactions, right? So we'll use some for transfer posting. For example, when we want to change the status of materials in our stock, if we want to say if these materials are unrestricted or blocked, or they have to go for quality inspection, what we do is we perform some transfer posting transactions using these movement types to indicate if what we're doing is changing the status of goods to unrestricted or to quality inspection. You'll become more familiar with this as we go on through the training. We also have the movement types for the transfers, if we're talking about a one-step transfer from same fund center and same fund. And if we're talking about a two-step stock transfer, or if we're talking about exceptional processes, and that we'll become more familiar with next week, the movement types required to make sure that we perform the disposal of goods through scrapping, for example. Okay, and a number of slides on that too. Okay, so before I dive into our master data slide here, for those of you who are new to all of this and all these concepts seem like a lot, any questions before we move on? I'm just going to make sure that...
Brian, may I intervene?
Yes, absolutely,
it's Cosimo
anytime.
here. Yeah, it's Cosimo Melpignano here. You can call me Mino. I think I'm quite an alien in this group. My last liquidation was quite in the Stone Age, was 10 years ago. but I found your explanation very clear. So thank you. As far as I understand, and so I will just intervene to thank you for the presentation, really, which is a quite clear one. That's why I believe you're not listening. Aside that there are a lot of experts in the group, the fact that you are not listening to any comments is because you have been much clearer.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much for those kind words. I needed that encouragement for a while. It's been an hour and 20 minutes, and I haven't heard much from attendees. I'm thinking it's because either they know about it or it's clear. Thanks for saying that it's quite clear. I know it's a lot. It's actually huge. There's a lot of concepts here that we're trying to make you understand. Just in a PowerPoint, you really become familiar with these once you start going into the system and playing around with T-codes, storage locations, fund centers. Honestly, it even took me a while to learn this when I first joined the team. At the beginning, we all felt like aliens to the system. And after a while, even after years of this, even though it's become more familiar, it's still complicated to use. Okay, so don't feel alienated by the complexity of this. Okay, that's why there's been GDP1, GDP2, PIRO, liquidations, and we're always kind of coming back to the Galileo decommissioning project. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Brian. I take it as an encouragement for myself. Thank you.
Please do, and know that we're here for students like you. Okay, that's what this training is for. And then we're expecting also from the experts to dive in at any time and bring some added value. Daniel, I think you want to intervene?
Well, yes. Well, in case that someone else wants to do it, they are most welcome. But I just wanted to share, thank you, Brian, for the presentation. I just want to understand the current moment and where we are coming from. As Brian said, this project started at GDP, the commissioning back 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So for us, it was difficult to digest. So I can only imagine how difficult it may be for someone who is not really acquainted with these concepts to digest everything in only one hour, 1 hour and a half. That's why we keep saying that this is only an introduction, and we will try to keep it really practical, because at the end of the day, when you guys are deployed in the missions, the aim is not for you to be a super expert in inventory, warehouse management, and the policies, but you probably will have plenty of actions to do in the system while you know the impact, but eventually you will have to perform a lot of transactions. That's why we are going to keep a lot of the time for the training in hands-on in the system. But just to share my experience from the past 3 years, at the end of the day, if you are not familiar with this business process, if after this session you can take away what's the difference between inventory and warehouse in terms of master data elements, how do they look like in terms of codes, inventory and warehouse, and that inventory is not really a physical place where you can find goods. It's just the books. It's where the ownership and the property of the piece of equipment is in terms of the system, but you will not find a exactly physical place in inventory where you can find those elements physically. It's in the storage, in the bins and the storage types that Brian was mentioning. For me, it was quite difficult to understand this concept initially, because I definitely, the name storage location automatically brings your mind to a particular location in a particular place, but it shouldn't be the situation here. So as I said, the takeaway, if you can just identify the difference between inventory and warehouse, which are the master data elements in those two in those two parts. And for example, the movement types that Brian was mentioning, those movement types are not really like physical movements of stuff, of equipment, but movements from the inventory point of view, right? We will see how these things are translated into the system. But as Mimo was saying correctly, and Brian, it's although it's presentation that take for us a while to understand and to try to convey to especially new users, as long as you pick up, 2-3 main concepts here, you'll see that as we go these 2 weeks, things will start to settle in your mind, and especially when you start to do things in the system. So my intervention was only to share my experience and to relax, or take away stress, especially for the students who are not really acquainted with these business processes. So over to you, Brian. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you very much. And we can't stress that enough. So thank you for jumping in. And now I know that we've gone through the first hour and 20 minutes. And apologies if you guys hear my son screaming and yelling in the background, but that's the situation we're in now. And today he feels like screaming. So let's just let him scream. And if you guys want a 5-minute break, and maybe we can take it. I've gone on for an hour and 20 minutes. I don't know if it's a good idea. Take 5 minutes, go grab some water, stretch. Okay, I didn't even realize that the first hour had gone by. It's just that we have so much to cover in very little time.
Brian, I think it's a good idea because we have old people in this training, and I don't want to offend these old people.
I was going to say, you said old people? Okay. All right. Yeah, let's take 5 minutes. All right, we'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, so I think 5 minutes are mostly up. I'll just wait an extra minute. Give us time to get a quick stretch, drink some water. Thanks for your interventions, Cosimo, Gianluca. Thank you. At any time, anyone else, feel free to jump in. So as Daniel was saying, and just a quick reminder, we as long as you guys can understand the difference between the inventory management concepts, warehouse management concepts, and the structural elements in them, that's fine. We've been talking about receiving goods, right? Putting them in inventory, which would be like kind of like having a list, a note of these things on a piece of paper versus having the actual thing, right, with us, next to us in a room, in a box. And now what we want to explain to you guys is another tough, let's say, number of concepts which relate to material master data. Okay, so you'll realize that when we start the transactions, we're going to be dealing a lot with material master data. Sorry. And what we're receiving basically is materials, right? But these materials are divided or have different types of specifications, right, based on the type of material that we're receiving. We're not going to treat vaccines the same way we're going to treat a laptop, the same way we're going to treat paper, the same way we're going to treat a car, right? So depending on the type of materials that we're receiving into our inventory and eventually putting into our warehouse, we're going to have to treat these differently, right? And now this is what we're going to learn about here with the material master data slides, right? So, and what this is. So the material master records contain information about the materials that the UN procures, stores, and ships. Okay, the integration of this information is put into Umoja, and it makes possible to store the material data for all relevant systems and components. Okay, so you have an understanding of this. Umoja has this master data of all the materials that are in our contracts that we use to create shopping carts, to purchase our goods and receive them into our inventory. These materials, once they're received into our inventory, have product IDs, right, that refer to them. So we refer to these materials as with the product ID numbers. These have their own descriptions, serialization numbers, and so on. So the materials can be classified based on several things.